Go. Guess we're on, I think. Yeah, we're on. Last time, we only had a few people. That was when we did it by telephone. So I thought that I would review the last week's class for just 10 minutes. It was really an important class because it showed in the most radical fashion how the rabbis really were involved, in many cases, in a revolution in understanding, re-understanding, reinterpreting the verses of the Torah in halachic cases. What we talked about last time was the wayward and rebellious son. So let's read the verses in the Torah in the Chumash that you have in front of you. It's page 1113. Page 1113 in the Eitz Chaim. I'll start reading. If a man has a wayward and defiant son, who does not heed his father or mother, and does not obey them after they have disciplined him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his town at the public place of his community. They shall say to the elders of his town, this son of ours is disloyal and defiant, he does not heed us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Thereupon the men of his town shall stone him to death. Thus you will sweep out evil from your midst, all Israel will hear and be afraid. The rabbis in Tractate Sanhedrin, chapter 8 of the Talmud, asked the question, and because he ate a large quantity of meat and drank a large quantity of wine, is that a reason to stone him? Rather, lo haya velo atid liot, ela darosh v'kabel sachar. It never was, and it never will be. Rather, study it and receive reward. What we have here is a clear moral consideration brought into the halachic process. The rabbis read the verses, and they say, it can't be, it doesn't make sense, it just doesn't fit, it's not ethical for us to stone a young man for a little bit of gluttony, a little bit of drunkenness, for disobeying his parents. And we don't go into the question, at least not here, why the rabbis are so certain that this doesn't make sense. Is it because they have a moral intuition? Is it because there's certain verse in the Torah that this contradicts? That's actually something we're discussing almost on Tuesday mornings. But here, we'll just say that clearly the rabbis are bringing an ethical consideration into the verses. They say it can't mean what it seems to mean, and therefore they come to the conclusion that it was just meant theoretical but not practical. It's to learn Torah and to receive reward, but we're never ever going to do it. We never did it, and we never will do it. Now there are dissenting opinions in the Talmud, but this is the major opinion, that it can't be. But it's not enough for the rabbis to say it can't be, and never was, never will be. How do they make sure that it never was and never will be? They make sure that it never was and never will be, that we never carried out, by interpreting the nitty-gritty details of the halakha, such that we'll never be able to prove a case against this young man. Why? Because it says in one of the verses we just read, that was verse 20, this son of ours is disloyal and defiant, he does not heed us. And the Hebrew there is enenu shomea bekolenu. He doesn't listen to our voice. In the Hebrew, it doesn't say, quote, doesn't listen to our voices. Rather, it says doesn't listen to our voice in the singular. And therefore, the rabbis come to the conclusion that the mother and father have to speak in a single voice. Now, you might think that means that educationally they have to give the same message. They can't go in two different directions. They can't confuse the kid. It certainly does mean that. But in addition, the rabbis take it literally. The father and mother have to speak in the same voice. In other words, the octave, the pitch of the mother and father's voice have to be the same musically. And if it's not, then we can't kill the kid. And the rabbis say if the Torah tells us that the parents have the same octave of voice, that probably means they also have to be the same height. And they also have to look exactly the same, such that if my wife walked into the room right now, you'd probably say, that's Hanan. So what it means is the rabbis constructed the halachic requirements in such a fashion that it never was and never will be. So that's just fascinating, that there's a verse in the Torah that clearly says black on white. It's really not so hard to understand. If the kid is disobedient, you kill him. And why? In order to create a deterrent, so that all Israel hear and be afraid, so you can have good, submissive children.
I was thinking after we had the class was that also that if the Torah verse that we think is cruel was sort of liberal for the times where a father could just
Yes.
on his own kill a child because he was
Right.
disobedient.
Yeah, we mentioned at the beginning of last time's class that these verses say father and mother, and not just father, as opposed to what you find in the Code of Hammurabi, in which the father can do whatever he wants with the son. And secondly, it says here that the father and mother have taken to the Beit Din, to the elders of the community. So it's certainly right what Nancy said. But beyond all that, the rabbi said, as far as the Torah goes in its time, it's still not enough. And so you have here a really, really powerful and amazing rabbinic revolution. That was last week. And now for this week. So this week's class is really amazing. It's really amazing. I say so myself. It's not the class, it's the material. As opposed to what we saw last time, in which I think with effort, everyone could understand the sources that I brought in English translation. The sources we're going to see this time, you really can't understand them without a lot of rabbinic background and understanding the nuance. The rabbis say so little. Take it back. The rabbis say so much in so few words. What we're going to see. Okay, here we go. We're going to read the verse in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 25, just 2 verses, 11 and 12. I'll read them in Hebrew and in English. V'chi yinatzu anashim yachdav, ish v'achiv, v'karva eshet ahad latzil et ishah miad makehu, v'shalcha yadah, v'chzika bimvushav, v'katzota et kapah, lo tachos einecha. Translation: when men strive together with one another, and the wife of the one draws near to deliver, the word in Hebrew is to save her husband out of the hand of him that is striking him, and puts forth her hand and grabs his private parts. She tries to save her husband by grabbing the private parts of the other man who's attacking her husband. Then you shall cut off her hand. Your eye shall have no pity. Very interesting. What we seem to have here is a law that's not in the framework of torts, but is in the framework of gender boundaries. In other words, it seems clear that if a man did what this woman did, he would not be subject to the same punishment. She's subject to the punishment because she is a she. So this is not a law that fits into the category of torts. This is what happens when you damage someone's ox. This is what happens when you damage his body. This is what happens when you punch him in the face. No, this is something different. It's not about the bodily damage she did to the other man. It's rather, it seems to be, that's the way I'm reading it, seems to be the simple meaning, it's because of her violation of gender boundaries. That seems to be the pshat, the simple meaning of the verse. And the punishment is quite severe. Apparently, we have to come to the conclusion that the punishment is severe because the violation is severe. There's a gender boundary here that was crossed that shall not be crossed. I want to look now at some other verses in Deuteronomy that I brought in the sheet and Mary Beth doesn't have. Okay. From which perhaps we could learn something about our core verses in Dvarim in Deuteronomy 25. If an unrighteous witness rise up against any man to bear perverted witness against him in court, then both the men between whom the controversy is shall stand before the Lord, which means before the court, before the priests and the judges shall be in those days. And the judges shall inquire diligently, and behold, if the witness be a false witness and hath testified falsely against his brother, Then shall ye do unto him as he has purposed to do unto his brother. So shalt thou put away evil from the midst of thee. And those that remain shall hear and fear, and shall henceforth commit no more any such evil in the midst of thee. Which means, if someone bears witness, gives testimony in court against someone, and if the testimony is accepted, the man who's being accused will be punished by the court, let's say with $1 million fine. And it turns out that the witnesses were lying, and the witnesses have to pay $1 million. That's what it seems to be. And it ends up by saying, verse 21, and thine eye shall not pity. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. That's the famous verse we know about eye for eye. And it seems to be saying here that if I bore witness in court saying that Mary Beth killed someone, God forbid, and the court would punish her with capital punishment if it accepts my testimony, and just before the court kills her, executes her, it turns out we do a investigation that I was lying. So it looks like the verse is saying that I will die because I tried to kill her. Now what's really, really powerful and fascinating here is it means that I am to be executed by the court, not for murder, but for attempted murder. So now, if we keep that in mind, that perhaps life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, means not only when you actually execute the crime of taking life, that your life is to be taken, but even if you attempt to do so. So let's look back at the verses we saw 2 minutes ago about the woman and the private parts. So she tried to, let's say, cut off the man's private parts. Even though she didn't succeed, assume she didn't succeed, we should do the same thing to her that she tried to do to him, but we can't. So perhaps cut off her hand is a replacement, the best we can do. In this measure for measure, she tried to amputate the man's private part, so we amputate her hand. Could be. That's probable. I'm just trying to say that this matter of cutting off her hand, because what she tried to do does have some foundation, does have some precedent in the words of the Torah we see in chapter 19. It's not the same thing. It's just to make it a little bit more palatable in the framework of Torah legislation. But still, my main claim is that the verse in chapter 25 is about gender, about borders, the terrible violation that she violated. So we're going to see how the rabbis understood the verses in chapter 25 totally differently than the way I've explained them for the past 5 minutes. Even though, again, I think I tried to explain the verses in chapter 25 according to the pshat, what it seems to be, the rabbis have a completely different interpretation. But before we see the rabbinic interpretation, we're going to see an interpretation of a famous Jewish leader who is not part of the rabbinic tradition. And this is Philo of Alexandria. You can look on Wikipedia or any place on the internet to see exactly who he was, but shortly, Philo of Alexandria was a very, very well-read and prolific reader and writer. He was the leader of the Jewish community of Alexandria in the first decades of the first century. So he's outside of the land of Israel. And from all his many writings, we know clearly that he wasn't part of the rabbinic tradition, probably didn't know the rabbinic tradition, but he took the Torah very seriously. He took Judaism very seriously. He wrote a whole corpus of writings. He wrote over 30 books about Judaism. And we assume that more or less he is reflecting the way Judaism was practiced in Alexandria in the first decades of the first century of the Common Era. Indeed so. His thought is very influenced by the Greeks. He writes in Greek. As far as we know, he didn't know Hebrew. He read the Torah in the Septuagint version, which means the Greek translation the translation of the Torah into Greek. So I urge you to find a place to hold on, because you're going to be scandalized by what he writes. So this is in a book he wrote called The Special Laws, Part 3. And the heading is about women not behaving immodestly. You can find this on the internet. It's easy to find. Marketplaces and council chambers, and courts of justice, and large companies and assemblies of numerous crowds, and a life in the open air, full of arguments and actions relating to war and peace, are suited to men. But taking care of the house and remaining in home are the proper duties of women. The virgins having their apartments in the center of the house within the innermost doors, and the full-grown women not going beyond the vestibule and outer courts. Like in ancient, in India, other places, you find that
That's how ancient Greek Athens was. That it was basically the women were kept
inside.
inside.
The young women inside, then the outer courtyard, the older women, the married women. Morris?
And in certain Muslim countries, at least among
To this day.
certain families, it's the same way today.
Okay? For there are two kinds of states, the greater and the smaller. And the larger ones, in other words, the greater ones, are really called cities. But the smaller ones are called houses, what we would call households. And the superintendence and management of these is allotted to the two sexes separately. The men having the government over the greater, in other words, over the city, over the polis, which government is called a polity, and the women that of the smaller, which is called economy, the household.
As recently as when I went to school, girls took home.
I was just going to say that. I took it also. I took shop, it was called.
The I shop for mechanical drawing, and the girls took semesters
Right.
home economics.
Exactly.
Everyone remembers the good old days. Therefore, let no woman busy herself about those things which are beyond the province of economy, but let her cultivate solitude, and not be seen to be going about like a woman who walks the streets in the sight of other men, except when it is necessary for her to go to the temple, if she has any proper regard for herself. The temple, of course, doesn't mean the temple in Jerusalem, but the local temple, what we would call a synagogue. And even then, let her not go at noon when the market is full, but rather have her go after the greater part of the people have returned home, like a well-born woman, a real and true citizen, performing her vows and her sacrifices in tranquility, so as to avert evils and to receive blessings. But when men are abusing one another or fighting, for women to venture to run out under pretense of assisting or defending them is a blameworthy action and one of no slight shamelessness, since even in the times of war and of military expeditions and of dangers to their whole native land, the law does not choose, the law means the Torah, does not choose that they should be enrolled as its defenders. Looking at what is becoming, as what is proper, which it thinks, meaning the Torah thinks, desirable to preserve unchangeable at all times and all places, thinking that this very thing is of itself better than victory. It is better to keep the women in their proper place than to send them out as soldiers and be victorious at war. We don't need that type of help from women.
Is he deriving this idea from the verses you read?
He has not mentioned the verses yet. He's expressing to us a basic intuition of what's right and wrong, which I think is partially based on the Torah and partially based on the world in which he lives.
What do they do with the
There are issues with this, obviously. You're right. You're right. Again, this is not part of the rabbinic tradition. This is outside of the rabbinic tradition, but it's a Jew who's a leader of his community writing for Jews. Okay. So he said, looking at what is becoming, what is proper, what it thinks desirable to preserve unchangeable at all times and all places, thinking that this very thing, that is the proper gender roles, is of itself better than victory or than freedom or than any kind of success and prosperity. Moreover, if any woman, hearing that her husband is being assaulted, being out of her affection for him carried away by love for her husband, should yield to the feelings which overpower her and rush forth to aid him, still let her not be so audacious as to behave like a man outrunning the nature of a woman. But even while aiding him, let her continue to be a woman. For it would be a very terrible thing if a woman, being desirous to deliver her husband from an insult, should expose herself to insult by exhibiting human life as full of shamelessness and liable to great reproaches for her incurable boldness. Women shouldn't be bold to go into the market and play around like men. For shall a woman utterly abuse in the marketplace and give vent to unlawful language? God forbid. And if any man use foul language, will not she stop up her ears and run away? That's what she should do. But as it is now, some women are advanced to such a pitch of shamelessness as not only, though they are women, to give vent to intemperate language and abuse among a crowd of men, but even, God forbid, to strike men and insult them with and insult them with hands practiced rather in works of the loom and spinning than in blows and assaults. So all she really knows is the loom, and now she's suddenly striking men, insulting them. Like competitors in the pancratium or wrestlers. She's acting like a wrestler. No good. And other things, indeed, may be tolerable, and what anyone might easily bear, but it is a shocking thing if a woman were to proceed to such a degree of boldness as to seize hold of the genitals of one of the men quarreling. For let not such a woman be let go on the ground that she appears to have done this action in order to assist her own husband, but let her be impeached and suffer the punishment due to her excessive audacity, so that if she should ever be inclined to commit the same offense again, she may not have the opportunity of doing so. And other women also, who might be inclined to be precipitate, and may they be taught by fear to be moderate and to restrain themselves. And let the punishment be the cutting off of the hand which has touched what it ought not to have touched.
This was written by a man who was terrified of a strong woman. The strength.
He believes that a strong woman of this type will erode the foundations that keep society stable.
Yeah, I know.
So my claim is that Philo's understanding of the verses, of our verse, is very plausible, and is perhaps even the simple, straightforward, original meaning of the verses.
And both Torah and Philo are putting forth the principle that many sociologists question whether punishment does deter.
Okay, I hear.
It does deter. Is punishment a deterrent?
It strikes me this kind of thinking violates the principle of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So the punishment is worse than what the crime was. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's interpreted, but it's the offending instrument.
right. It may be different than eye for an eye, but the offending instrument is to be focused on. It's measure for measure in that sense.
Well, I thought the
The
other
hand.
example you gave it was clear. The apparent attempted murder is punished as if it were an actual murder. We could argue
Yeah.
about this one on the basis, but
And clearly, according to Philo, and I do think this is the simple meaning of the verses, it's not just a matter of torts. It's a matter of gender violation. And were a man to do what this woman did, his punishment would not be the same. Perhaps he would not be punished at all. She's punished because she did what a woman shouldn't do. Yes?
Philo sees her as defying all of these whole host of rules, not just one.
Of all of the?
A whole long list of rules she's defied. She's out of the house. She's
Right.
in the market during the day. She's interacting with men. She's, it's not just that she grabs somebody, it's that she's done all these things where she's in the situation where she can.
Right.
Whereas the simple Torah doesn't say she shouldn't be out of the house in the first place. It just says if she does this.
You're right, the Torah doesn't say it, But Philo is putting forth an interpretation, which I think is plausible, that her punishment is so severe because she's violated all of the gender violations, and this one is at the pinnacle of the pyramid.
It's all the fences.
All the fences, right. Gilda?
I'm sure you don't watch TV, television, but
On the treadmill, I do.
I'm sorry.
On the treadmill in JCC in Dallas, I do.
Well, I suspect also that you're not watching Netflix specifically. Well, the reason I'm bringing that up is because in the last couple of days, I've watched a couple of documentaries. One of which is called Not One of Us, and it's about the Satmar.
Someone told me about this.
Oh my gosh, my head is just so messed up from, I can't believe, I have a heart that no matter how different a Jew believes, he's still my dimension, he's still
Mhm.
one of me. But what I saw in this documentary has me feeling rage. A woman wants a gift from her husband. She has 7 children. A gift from her husband because he beats her. And her voice cannot be heard. They took these children and instead of leaving them with the mother, they divvied them up amongst the family. His side, never. Her side is not even relevant. And the hardship that's created, these children want their mother. If the father has never been, the man that beats his wife is not a wonderful father, generally speaking.
Yeah, yeah.
It was unbelievable. I'm just citing one vignette. The whole documentary is frightening. It was frightening. And I bring it up because this was written in the 1st century. What I saw was 2017.
Yes.
And it's real. It's absolutely real.
This is an issue where Orthodox Muslim law is actually a little bit more liberal. A man can, of his own will, divorce the wife, whether she consents or not. She cannot by herself divorce him, but she is allowed to go to a court and ask the court to divorce them.
Okay, so all this is backdrop to the rabbinic interpretations of these verses from the book of Deuteronomy. Like I said at the beginning, rabbinic interpretations are few words with deep, wide ideas. We'll have to read it a few times. It'll take a while to sink in. So here we go. We're at the same page we were just reading. After Philo, I brought at the bottom of that page from Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Baba Kama, page 28a. And the Hebrew, I'll read the Hebrew and the English. The Hebrew says, Tashma, v'katzot et kapa, mamon. In English, come in here. Then thou shalt cut off her hand. That's the verse that we saw. Means a monetary fine. So, that's not so radical. Just like the rabbi said, an eye for an eye means mamon, means money. So here they're saying that cut off her hand means money. It's different than what Philo said, right? Philo wanted her hand cut off, and again, that's the pshat of the Torah. But the rabbis say there shall be no such thing. That's barbarous. There's another statement about hand becoming money on the same sheets that I gave out. At the very, in the middle of the next page, if you see, I brought from Sifrei on the book of Deuteronomy, Sifrei to Sefer Dvarim, section 293, page 312. In the 6 or 7 lines there in English, we're going to read from the 3rd line, where it says, Rabbi Yehuda says. Everyone see what Rabbi Yehuda says? Okay. Rabbi Yehuda says, it says here, your eye shall have no pity. And it says elsewhere, your eye shall have no pity. Just as the meaning of your eye shall have no pity elsewhere is monetary compensation, such as the meaning of your eye shall have no pity, here monetary compensation. This is called a gzeira shava, a comparison, a linguistic comparison. In the verses that we're talking about, about this woman. It says, cut off her hand, or I shall have no pity. Now that phrase, or I shall have no pity, is found in other places in the Torah. A number of other places. And one of those other places, the rabbis have already explained that in the context there, a corporal punishment is transmuted into money. So the rabbis say, and then the words, your I shall have no pity, are like a bridge that connect the two parshiot, the two paragraphs. If in one paragraph we changed corporal punishment into money, corporal I don't mean execution, I mean physical punishment into money. So then in other paragraphs where the same words appear, the I shall have no pity, there also we will transfer corporal punishment into monetary punishment. Without going into all the details, just want to show you that there are two different places here which we're talking about monetary fines and not about physical punishment. Now that doesn't go to the core issues of gender. It's just the beginning of seeing how the rabbis commuted a little bit of the, let's say, brutality or cruelty of this idea of cutting off the hand. That's just to get you ready for the main course that we're about to partake of. Okay. So now we're back to Tractate Baba Kama, page 28a, and if you print it out the way I print it out, it moves to the next piece of paper, right, the next page. So I'm going to read the English from beginning 10. It's about 7 lines. Do you guys have it?
No.
Let me see if I can help. Yeah, this is it.
Oh.
Yeah, because that's the heading is on the previous page. Yeah.
I thought you had another page.
Yeah. There's very little material here.
Oh, yeah.
So I'll read the whole thing, and then we'll go back and read it again. Does not this ruling apply even in a case where there was no other possibility for her to save? No. It applies only where she was able to save by some other means. Whereas, in a case where there was no other possibility for her to save, she is exempt. In this case where there was no other possibility for her to save, her resort to force should be considered as if exercised by an officer of the court. I didn't read the material in brackets. It's added by the translator because I think it takes away a little bit from understanding what's going on here. So I read it, and you probably didn't understand anything. So I'm going to read it again. Does not this ruling apply even in a case where there was no other possibility for her to save? I'm going to focus on that word save. In Hebrew, lahatzil. By using that word, the rabbis are assuming a very, very central assumption that she is in the process of saving human life. She's a good Samaritan. In other words, the way the rabbis are reading it is that there's the two men fighting, and her husband is about to lose his life. There's an attempted murder going on, an attempted murder. And she is a good Samaritan. So the rabbis are reading our verses in a very, very specific fashion. And we know that only from one word that they use, lahatzil, to save. Okay, so she's a good Samaritan. She's saving human life. And the rabbis apply now the parameters that they know from other categories of saving human life, which is you can do whatever you need to save human life, and you're certainly not punished for saving human life. So why is she punished? Why does it say cut off her hand? Okay, we know that cut off her hand only means money, but why is she punished when she's saving human life? So now we read it again. The same words. Does not this ruling apply even in a case where there was no other possibility for her to save? No, it doesn't apply in that case, because if there was no other way to save her husband except by pulling at the genitals of the man, then of course what she did is not something to be fined for, it's something that she should be lauded for. So no, says the Talmud. It doesn't apply, the law of the Torah doesn't apply if what she did was the only means she had to save her husband. And you can imagine that in many cases it will be the only means, because she doesn't know how to use a gun and she's not trained in the ways of war. But what is the soft underbelly of a man? That's the way she can do. So fine. So why is she being punished with a fine? I'm reading the middle of the second line. Because it applies under the law of the Torah that says cut off her hand, which means money, applies only when she was able to save him by some other means. So she sees her husband about to be murdered, and she has a means to prevent that murder that doesn't involve pulling at his genitals. And she specifically decides not to go the other means, but to do this. And I have to make it clear, the other means will do less damage to the attempted murderer. Yeah, she had a frying pan in her hand, and we're looking at the case, and we know that if she hits the attempted murderer over the head with a frying pan, we know she'll save her husband, but she specifically decides to do something that's unnecessary given the circumstances. She uses undue force. That's why she's being fined, because she saved human life using undue force. I just want to say one more sentence, or a few more. What the rabbis are doing here is assimilating this case into the classical laws of the Good Samaritan. And in Tractate Sanhedrin, the law is black on white that if you see someone who's about to murder someone else, you have the option and the mitzvah to jump in and save the victim, but you have to use as little force as possible. You always have to save while trying not to kill. And if you use undue force, then you are to be punished for it. That's what it says in all of these cases. The rabbis are saying that our case about the woman is no different than any other case of the Good Samaritan who purposely uses undue force to save the victim. Comments and questions?
So if she stabbed him, more likely she would kill him. I mean, it would be worse.
The frying pan was a good example.
Okay, she could have given him she could have killed him with the frying pan.
You injected a piece of information that I didn't see, maybe I missed it, that she didn't just touch his private parts. You injected that she had a knife and was going to cut them off.
Not necessarily a knife, but she's doing something that is endangering.
It doesn't say that.
I know it doesn't say it.
It says, what's the exact words? But if she just reached out to touch them,
The Torah says grab. She's trying to prevent
give a little,
the murder. She's trying to prevent the murder.
it's almost like giving a patch to your dog to stop doing whatever he's doing,
And I understand.
She gets his attention away from
I understand.
doing, but that doesn't injure him.
No, I understand. I'm explaining why I'm explaining it, because I am taking note of the Hebrew phraseology. The rabbis are using the same words that they use in Tractate Sanhedrin when they explain the case of someone who's a Good Samaritan, sees an attempted murder taking place, and uses undue force to prevent. The rabbis are using the same language that they use there, using here, because the rabbis are trying to subtly, completely reframe the case in front of us. That this is a Good Samaritan who's overstepping the boundaries.
So what it says in English here really isn't
What it means. If you see, in Hebrew, it also doesn't say what English says, but the phraseology in Hebrew is the same phraseology that's used in a different set of laws, as I said.
If I were to just read this,
Yeah, that's why I said at the beginning, you couldn't get what's going on here without my commentary.
Okay, what puzzles me is that they're only just talking about the husband, and nothing is fiercer than a mother protecting her child.
Yeah.
What are the laws there? What is she allowed and not allowed to do if she's protecting her child?
The answer is that it doesn't matter if it's a she or a mother. The laws, that's exactly the point, that the rabbis are removing gender from being consideration in the laws of torts, removing gender. I understand that the pshat of the verses is like Philo said, that the whole story is about gender. And the rabbis are going against the grain of the Torah, I think, and telling us that gender has nothing to do with it. And they're interpreting the verses in a fashion in which gender has nothing to do with it. This is simply another example of the Good Samaritan who oversteps the boundaries of Good Samaritanness and uses undue force. And now look at what it says after the place where we stopped reading. Whereas, in a case where there is no other possibility for her to save, she's exempt. And I would think that the rabbis are trying to say that in 99% of the cases, she has no other means to save. She's doing the only thing she can do to save her husband. She's usually going to be exempt. But the Torah gives you one case of 1 in 1,000 in which we punish her because she overstepped the boundaries. Now look the way it goes on. In this case, in other words, when she did only what she needed to do to save her husband, in this case where there was no other possibility for her to save, her resort to force should be considered as an exercise by an officer of the court. Which means, just like in the case of any Good Samaritan, who sees a murder about to take place and jumps in and saves, we consider his act, even if he kills someone, we consider it to be that he was acting at the behest of the court. He was acting at the behest of the Jewish people. If I see someone with a gun about to shoot someone else, and I go in, I shoot the person who's about to murder, I am exempt. Why am I exempt? Because it's if I acted as a police officer. At that moment, the halakha gives me a warrant to act and kill in order to save human life. And what we're being told here, just let me finish the thought, is that if a woman has no other way to save a man except by pulling at his genitals, and she does so and thereby saves a man from being hurt or murdered, she's considered to be an officer of the court, and she gets a gold star. What did it say? She gets a gold star. In other words, despite the fact that see it differently, it doesn't matter that she's a woman. It doesn't matter.
But isn't that why in recent times we actually had to create the Good Samaritan law, so a Good Samaritan wasn't...
The halakha in that sense is 2,000 years ahead of...
But I mean, they actually did with that.
Yeah.
Like that, because if a doctor was trying to save somebody and that person died, they could be taken.
Yeah, so the halakha is a Good Samaritan law over 2,000 years ago.
Where I have a problem is that there's 3 people involved here. And it's going to be the 2 men's testimony, whether it was necessary or not, because a woman can't be a witness. Am I correct? In Judaism.
You're correct, but not correct. I think that what's important here is not how we apply this. Forget about applying it in the real world. What's important here is the principle that the rabbis are looking at verses that seem to say that gender has influence upon how we adjudicate tort cases. And the rabbis are coming to say, you misunderstood it completely. Gender has nothing to do with the way we adjudicate court cases. That's the central point here that the rabbis are making. And I brought the material from Philo just as a contra, as a contrary, that you could have read our verse in the Torah, and you probably should read our verse in the Torah as talking about gender. The rabbis bend over backwards in a very, very creative reading of the verses to take gender out of the equation.
So basically the rabbis say, Torah says what we say it says, not what the Pshat seems to say it says.
Yeah. Right, the whole object of this 9 series of classes is to show that the liberty that the rabbis took in understanding the verses, they had certain principles that they understood are Torah. And if the Torah seems to say differently, the Torah has a vote, but not a veto.
Black, but when you really get it twisted around, so you see that it says white.
You could say it like that.
It's an oversimplification, but it's we believe this is an important principle, so we're going to find a way to interpret this so that we can say that this, which seems to say something else, we interpret it to say this.
Many times, I'll tell you a joke. Many times when I teach this or the material about Ben Soram or the rebellious son, someone in the audience raises his or her hand and says, Rabbi, by teaching this, aren't you giving ammunition to the reformers? And I say, yeah. The rabbis were reformers, right? They created a Judaism that's very different than the Judaism that Philo, for example, knew. They didn't do it in one day, and they had a developing tradition, etc., etc., etc. But in the end, the rabbinic Judaism they created is very different than what you would think you should be doing based on the simple Torah Shebechtav, the simple written Torah. It's important to realize that. We'll go on? We'll go on. So now we're going to read the next source, which is the Sifrei Dvarim. The Sifrei is the Tanaitic, Halachic, Midrash to the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy. When I say Tanaitic, I mean before the year 200 of the Common Era. When I say Halachic, I mean legal and not extra legal. So the Sifrei is the Tanaitic, Halachic, Midrash, meaning interpretation, to the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy. In this case, it's Deuteronomy. We already read the last few lines of this, Rabbi Yehuda. Now reading just the first 2.5 lines. And this is going to be a different interpretation than the one that we just read, but going in the same direction of taking gender out of the equation. So I'll read the whole thing, the 2.5 lines, and I'll read it again. Then you shall cut off her hand. Quote from the Torah. It teaches that you are obligated to save her. Huh? What's the connection? How do we know that if you are unable to save her by cutting off her hand, you save her by taking her life? The verse says, your eye shall have no pity. You probably didn't understand a word. It's complicated. In order to explain it, we're going to move to the source that comes afterwards, at the bottom of the page, from Tractate Sanhedrin, chapter 8, Mishnah 7. It's there a different subject, but I want to see the usage of language there. So we'll read the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, chapter 8, Mishnah 7. These one saves by taking their life, one pursuing his fellow to kill him, or to commit homosexual rape, or to rape a betrothed woman. But one who pursues after a beast to commit bestiality, or one who intends to desecrate the Sabbath, or one who intends to practice idolatry, we do not save them by taking their life. I want to ask if anyone can now understand when we say save, what do we mean? Save from what? Yes. We save means to save from committing a sin. There are some cases in which we don't save you from committing a sin. Rather, we let you commit it, then we bring you to court. But there are some rare cases in which we save you from committing a sin by killing you. So you die pure and don't die tainted by sin.
That makes it sound like we're allowing you to reach salvation somewhere in an afterlife.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. It does have that connotation. So now let's think. The second half of the Mishnah we just read says, but one who pursues after a beast to commit bestiality, one who intends to desecrate the Sabbath, and one who intends to practice idolatry, we do not save them by taking their life. So excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. If I see someone running after an idol, and he's screaming, I'm going to worship that idol, I'm in love with that idol is God. And I say to myself, it's forbidden to commit idolatry, and if this person commits idolatry, he is liable to be stoned by the Torah. Let me save him from his sin by killing him before he gets to the idol. No. The halakha says we do not save them by taking their life. We let them commit the sin, and then we bring them to court. And if there's enough witnesses, and if they did under the proper circumstances, we'll stone them. But we don't prevent them from committing the sin. And the same thing with the other two cases. I see someone running after the Sabbath to desecrate it. right? Which means I see someone wake up in the morning and he puts on his overalls and he says to his wife and his children, I'm going to work to build a building. So if I'm there and I'm walking to shul, I might say, he's about to desecrate the Sabbath, and I know the Torah says if he does so, he should be stoned, so I'll save him from the sin by killing him. No, don't do that. You don't save him from the sin. Rather, you let him sin, and then you take him to court. And if there's 2 witnesses that he did what he's not supposed to do, he's to be stoned. Wait a second.
Likelihood of the court taking their life is nil.
Because of other regulations.
Right.
Exactly.
And then on the other ones, you're preventing them from doing bodily harm.
Exactly. I'm getting to that. You're ahead of me, but you're right. Mary Beth wanted to say something, or Morris?
I just wanted to explain the difference between those.
All right, so we're getting to that. And the third example of a case in which I do not save someone by taking their life is someone running after an animal to commit bestiality, right? He says, I'm going to go to the animal and do what I have to do, sexual intercourse with that animal, and I know that the Torah says if he does that, he's liable to be stoned. I do not kill him to prevent the sin, rather I let him sin, but then I bring him to court, and if the court convicts him, he'll get his punishment. And of course, in 99% of the cases, that's the law. We don't prevent someone from sinning by taking their life. But there are 3 cases, just 3 cases, which we kill to save someone from sinning. And of course, Nancy was right when she pointed out those 3 cases are cases in which there is a victim. So we're saving the victim by saving the criminal from his sin. Okay?
In fact, I think some people, maybe some women, especially these days, might want to expand that to say simply to rape.
I understand. So let's now look at the beginning of the Mishnah. We read it many times. Read it again. These one saves by taking their life. One who pursuing his fellow to kill him. So someone is running after John Smith to kill John Smith, and I see what's happening. I have a gun, and I kill the murderer before he commits the crime in order to save the murderer from his sin, thereby saving the victim from dying. But the language that this Mishnah uses is I save the perpetrator from his sin. And the same thing with someone going to commit homosexual rape. I prevent the crime of forcing oneself upon another person, male, by killing the rapist before he commits the crime. And the same thing with someone who's running to rape a betrothed woman, which means either a woman who is engaged or married, and Morris is right, according to the technicalities of this particular Mishnah, if someone's running to rape an unmarried woman, I do not save the rapist by killing him. Rather, and now I'll move from this Mishnah to other laws, in cases in which I don't have permission to save the criminal from committing the crime, if there is a victim, what I do is I try to prevent the crime without killing the perpetrator. For example, I see someone running to rape a woman who's not married. I'm supposed to beat him over the head, I'm supposed to trip him up, and I'm supposed to yell and scream and all those things, but I'm not supposed to kill him. Whereas if he's running to kill a human being, or to rape a betrothed woman, or to commit homosexual rape, I'm allowed to go so far as to kill him to save him from his crime.
Okay, why, and this may be a little off the subject, but why is raping a betrothed woman different than raping any woman?
Yeah, well, first, the answer is that it is different, according to the halakha, and of course I understand that that's not politically correct today, because in the case of a woman who's not married, he's committing, number one, an act of bodily injury, but he's not committing an act of adultery, because she's not married. So it's just the case of a man running after a non-married woman to rape her is equivalent to the case of somebody running after me to cut off my hand in the halakha. It's a terrible thing, but it's not that he's about to commit a crime that's equal to murder. And therefore, the Good Samaritan who sees someone running after Hanan to cut off Hanan's hand should do everything to save me, please, but without killing the guy. Whereas if he's on his way to kill me, then the Good Samaritan can go so far as to killing him to save him from the crime of killing me. I understand, of course I understand that this is not what you would consider to be modern ethics, but I'm doing it all just to bring it back, as the Torah says. Although it's not forced in the Torah, in the force it's an option. It's an option. So now we know what the phrase means when we say to save someone from their crime. Now we know. Now we can use that knowledge and go back to what we're reading in the Sifrei Dvarim. Here we go. We're back to where we started from. Then you shall cut off her hand. It teaches that you are obligated to save her.
Save her from doing what she's getting ready to do.
Yes. In other words, the rabbis are reading this, that she is an attempted murderer. There are two men fighting, and from the point of view of this particular midrash we're learning now, these two men are just having a good time. They're not going to really kill each other. They're just playing around. They're just fighting. And this woman comes in, unwarranted, for no reason at all, and attempts murder. She attempts murder. Well, if she attempts murder, then we need a good Samaritan who's going to prevent her from murdering. Let's read on. How do we know that if you are unable to save her by cutting off her hand, you save her by taking her life? The verse says, I shall have no pity. In other words, the rabbis are reading this as attempted murder. It's a serious thing. This woman is a criminal. And we have to save her from her sin. Of course, even though she's a criminal and she's about to kill, you try to save her from her sin without killing her. As in all other cases, when you see someone trying to murder someone, you try to prevent it without killing the attempted murder. But if you have no choice, you're allowed to kill to save human life. That being the rabbinic interpretation in the Sifrei, let's go back to the verses and see the way the rabbis are reading the verses. So before I go back, let me just remind you, we've seen three ways of reading the verses today. Philo, and the Talmud in Tractate Baba Kama, and the Sifrei. We're now going to read the verses according to the Sifrei. Okay? Here we are. Chapter 25, verse 11. When men strive together with one another, they're having a good time. They're fighting a little bit. They'll get a bloody nose. Black eye? No, not too bad. And the wife of one of them draws near to deliver her husband out of the hand of him that is striking him. She pretends that she's saving life. She's really just a murderer. She's just finding a pretext to kill her husband's companion or competitor, and puts forth her hand and grabs his private parts. This is an act of attempted murder. Verse 12, then she'll cut off her hand. Verse 12 is speaking to everyone in this room. If you're walking down the street and you see a woman doing a thing like this, she's about to commit murder, then you have to jump in there and cut off her hand to prevent her from killing. And if you can't save the poor man by cutting off her hand, then you should go so far as your eye shall have no pity and shoot her in the head. Shoot her, so she doesn't commit murder. So Nancy says, far-fetched. I won't argue with Nancy. But so look what the rabbis have done. They've said that this law is no different than the Good Samaritan law any other place. You see a murder about to happen, run in there and try to save the victim first by not necessarily killing the murder, but just putting out of commission. If that doesn't work, then your eye shall have no pity. Kill the murderer before he does what he's going to do. Which means, I'll just summarize, that this has nothing to do with women. It's just another example of the straightforward tort law of the Good Samaritan.
If it's no different, why does the Torah have to repeat it? If it's no different, why does the Torah have to repeat it?
Don't know.
We
Well, I'll tell you one thing I just remembered that I didn't include in the source sheet, which is that according to one rabbinic interpretation, listen to this, this is the source for the Good Samaritan law. The Torah doesn't say it anyplace else. This is the source. It depends how you interpret other verses, but according to one opinion, this is the source. Where else does the Torah say that you're allowed to kill someone to save him from killing someone else? So I'm telling you, it may be there's no other place. Okay, so we see that there are two very different rabbinic interpretations that come to counter Philo's interpretation. I'm not saying they knew Philo's interpretation, but they knew what seems to be the simple reading of the verses, and they said anything but that. Let's just go over what we learned. So the Sifrei's interpretation, we just said that these two men are just having a good time, perhaps they're doing some damage to each other, nothing too bad. The woman comes in to kill one of the men, and we're commanded as good Samaritans to save her from her sin, first by cutting off her hand. If that doesn't help, then even by your I have no pity, killing her to save her from killing. That's the interpretation of the Sifrei. It had nothing to do with gender, just like every other law of the Good Samaritan. The other way we had of learning this, of the Talmud in tractate Baba Kama, was different. What we saw in Baba Kama was that verse 12 is a directive to the court after the fact. Remember, according to the Sifrei, verse 12 is during the act. It's telling the Good Samaritan, jump in there quickly and do something to save that man before he's killed by that terrible, cruel woman. But according to Baba Kama, and we can go back to Baba Kama. Baba Kama was the top of a piece of paper, and I'm just reviewing now to make sure we have everything clear in our minds. Baba Kama said, does not this ruling apply even in a case where there's no other possibility for her to save? No, it applies only where she was able to save by some other means. So there the case is that this woman is the Good Samaritan. Right? In the Sifrei, we're the Good Samaritan, and she's the evil one. Whereas according to Baba Kama, she's the Good Samaritan. What happens? She sees two men fighting, and one of them is going to kill the other. So she's the Good Samaritan, and she jumps in there. And if she jumps in there and grabs hold of his private parts and saves a man from being killed, and there was no other way that she could have saved, then we give her a gold star. What's the verse talking about? The verse is talking about that she had other means to save, but she didn't utilize them. She just jumped to the heat of the moment. Then we penalize her for using undue force with a monetary fine. But in this way also, Baba Kama, it's nothing to do with gender. It's the simple, straightforward laws of the Good Samaritan.
Two comments. Again, I understand the point we're making is about gender, but the one comment is there's a lot of intent here that no one can know what the intent is of the woman either way on either of these. And two, the second part of the Sifrei with Rabbi Yehuda seems to sort of contradict.
Oh, it does. That Rabbi Yehuda is back to the Baba Kama.
But yet he's in.
Yeah. He disputes with the first opinion. In other words, the Sifrei includes both the opinion of Baba Kama and its own approach.
What about you have to know the intent? How do you know that the intent of the man is just playful fighting, or that one is not murdering the other, or the intent of the woman that she thinks the guy is murdering him? So much is.
But from my perspective, it doesn't matter. We're just setting the theory here. If you're asking how the court will adjudicate this, you're right. It depends on witnesses and depends on circumstances. I don't know.
You're acting to cut off her hand or kill her on what you think her intent is.
Okay, let's apply what you're saying. Let's try with the way of the Sifrei. So the Sifrei says that the Sifrei said that she is an attempted murderer. It could be that once we learn the principle, we really can't apply it in this particular case. It's only here to teach us the principle. When we'll be able to apply it? When we see a clear-cut case in which two men are just strolling are on the beach and a man or a woman or a man comes and suddenly lunges and is about to do something terrible, and then we are all commanded to jump in and save. Yeah.
Sentence number 11 doesn't really give enough detail
Right.
to know whether she's trying to kill the attacker or whether she's just trying to stop him.
Right, and that gives the rabbis leeway and freedom, flexibility to interpret the way they see fit.
But the point that you're making is that what they're doing is taking gender out of it.
Yeah, really, this is a very simple class. The learning part of it is complicated, but the ultimate point is simple. It's simple, but it's still astounding that you have a text that would seem to be so simple and so straightforward, and its principles are so clear that gender matters. And the rabbis insist that gender doesn't matter. That is really taking quite a step towards what we would call modernity. But this is literally 2,000 years ago, and it is another example in many examples of how the rabbis took liberties with the Torah in order to apply certain principles that they understood to be divine or true or proper or fair or just. They didn't do anything like that with divorce law. Well, they did a little bit. I mean, we may get to that. I don't want to reveal too much. Anyone want to comment, question further, bring up something unrelated?
I don't know, the only other thing I can think of is that you talk of monetary fine for a woman that's really on her husband, because he owns everything. She doesn't have anything.
Okay.
This is also why she would try to save her husband. Because without a husband, she's got nothing.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay.
Or not. She doesn't have a brother.
But
Earl-
that's only if she doesn't have children.
Right.
Earl was about to say something.
Okay, this example reminds me of we went to a lecture at SMU last week. And you were there, right? Isn't that fantastic?
It was wonderful.
That was wonderful. So a scholar named Christine Hayes came down from Yale University, and she has a lecture which I found you can easily find. You can find the whole lecture on YouTube, and it's called "What's So Divine About Divine Law?"
Uh-huh.
But just very shortly, briefly, what she outlines, I'm going to oversimplify a little bit, but she cites that the Greek view of divine law is that it's universal, it applies to all nations, it's perfect, it's immutable, it's rational. So that when you hear one of those laws, you probably would have come to that conclusion yourself. And that the Greeks, specifically the Stoics, but according to her, this became widespread accepted view of law during the Hellenistic period. The counterpoint to that is positive law, which is man's law, and it's the opposite of all those characteristics. Men can change it, and it's not perfect, and it could be particular to one nation. It's not universal, and so on. And then she went on to say that the rabbis of the Talmud completely ignore that model and that dualism, okay, and say that divine law is divine not because it's universal, not because it's natural, not because we intuitively understand the rightness of it and the logic of it, that in the Jewish view that divine law is divine for one reason and one reason only, and that's because it came from God. God said so. And also that the rabbis believed, and they kind of intermixed some qualities from both of those two lists of characteristics, that God gave them the authority to interpret that law and to apply it to the new generation. And that seems to me this is an example. It's changeable and flexible. And that's exactly what you're talking about here. In fact, in her lecture, she cites some examples that are very similar to this. So I just wanted to commend that lecture. You can find it on YouTube if anyone's interested. It was wonderful. We bought the book.
Included at the end, which was fascinating. Her lecture really went up to the year 700. But she said at the end, the problems that we're having today is that people were taking the Greek definition
Right.
of divine law and putting it on the biblical
Mhm,
definition
mhm.
of divine law.
Right.
That it's not changeable.
Trying to
It's
apply
not
that Greek
flexible
understanding to
to
the
it,
Torah.
and that's why we're running
And she
into
accuses
problems.
Philo of that. In fact, she talked about Philo as in part of her lecture, but it's really a marvelous lecture that I would encourage anyone to go listen to. And I think it directly relates to what we're talking
That
about.
Philo
It's a great
thought
speech.
the divine law to be immutable. You're saying.
Right.
He used a
I mean,
Greek
she,
model.
And she just
Yeah.
says point blank, Philo was a Hellenist and he was trying to squeeze an understanding of Judaism and Torah into the Greek model.
Yes.
And
She says some ways Maimonides, so that was
some
beyond her lecture,
Maimonides
came
as
out in
well.
that way.
Yeah.
And we all know
Yeah.
that historically, that both Philo and Maimonides looked to Greek philosophy as a certain guide.
Right.
And they self-consciously tried to interpret Judaism in the light of Western philosophy, which is traceable back to the Greek. So
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway.
It's important in this context to use the term partnership, right? The rabbis saw a partnership between God and the Torah and the Jewish people. It's represented by the rabbis.
If she mentioned that, she talks about the rabbi saw as a partnership between God
Yes.
and men. She mentions that.
Okay, then she covered it all, okay?
She did a great job. It was one of the best lectures I've ever heard.
Was a
Yeah.
great speaker, and yeah.
What's the name of the book?
Not,
What is divine about divine
Oh,
law?
that's the name of the book and the
That's
lecture.
the name of the book. Well, the lecture is What's So Divine About Divine Law, but she said the
But the
publishers
Yale
made her
Press
take the "so" out of the name of the
Actually,
book.
the
They thought it'd be
lecture-
too provocative.
the lecture is,
Yeah, but you'll find it
so,
on the internet as
Oh, okay.
What's So Divine About
but she
Divine Law.
liked it having so, but the publishers didn't.
Got it.
Anyway.
Okay, so that's part of the theory behind the details that we're seeing here. Very good. So we said we're coming back December 3rd, right? That's what it said it was, approximately?
Fifth or
Third is Sunday,
Oh,
and fifth will be
that's right, it's the Tuesday. Yeah.